Well, friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Now, he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and just then there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. She was bent over and was quite unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." When he laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. But the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites! Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said this, all his opponents were put to shame, and the entire crowd was rejoicing at all the wonderful things that he was doing. Well, one of the things that the scriptures talk about a lot and that we fall prey to is this idea that we have a hard time evaluating things on just a set standard, and instead we like to compare. All right, like when I was in school, kids always were asking the teacher, can we be graded on a curve, please? We want to be graded on a curve. We don't want absolute grades, okay? And then whenever we talk about anything that happens, the questions I often get are comparison questions. For example, if we were talking about Vacation Bible Camp this year, and if I tell you, all right, we had 45 kids, one of the questions I get is, how many did you have last year? All right, as if, that makes a difference in how many we had this year. And in fact, but it does to them. So they go, how many do you have this year? 45. How many do you have last year? The answer is 19. And somehow the 45 now sounds better. Okay? Even though it's still the same number of children, it's the same number of kids getting the message this year, but people want to compare, okay? So we always like to compare. We do this in so many things. We compare to what has been. But the problem is that makes the standard what things are. All right? It makes the standard of things the way they are. For example, to go back to that Vacation Bible Camp example, last year, like I said, we had 19. So if we had had 30, which is what Felicia had as her original goal, we would have said, great, look at that, we have 30 instead of 19. And we never would have thought, but you could have had 45. Okay? Because we didn't think in those terms. We weren't thinking about that. And so if we had gotten 30, we wouldn't have felt that it was 15 fewer than we might have had. We would have just thought, oh, it's better than it was. This willingness to accept the status quo as the way things are or the way things ought to be can limit us, and it's one of the things we see in this passage. So in this story, what happens is that Jesus is in a synagogue on the Sabbath, and there is a woman who shows up who has been crippled for 18 years. And so she's unable to stand up, clearly she's in pain, and so she's there. And the question becomes, what do you see in this picture? What do you see? There's power in what you see. There's power in little words that we're going to see in this passage that talk about how people approached this situation. Because the reality is that as you go into a situation, what you see determines how you respond. What you see determines how you're going to think about it, okay? What you see will point you as to what might be, and that is going to control how you respond. So the people in this story look at this situation and they clearly see different things. When Jesus heals the woman, all right, what happens is that the synagogue leader saw a rules violation. All right? So that is what he saw. What he saw was work being done on the Sabbath. You shouldn't do that. And then he sees it in terms of the status quo. He says, look, there's 6 days in which you can work. Come on those days. Why aren't you coming on those days? Why are you here on the Sabbath day? You could be coming the rest of the week. Never mind that probably no one else was there on the rest of the week, okay? Kind of like, somebody shows up at church on Sunday and you go, why don't you come back tomorrow? We're all off, but hey, why don't you come back tomorrow, all right? Come on those days and be cured, all right? So as far as he can see, he sees the status quo. He sees a person who's been crippled for 18 years, and his response is like, what's one more day? You've been crippled for 18 years. What's one more day? Come back tomorrow. Why are we going to violate the rules that have been working just fine, and you've been crippled for 18 years, and that is the status quo, that is the way things are? What's wrong with that? And instead, what happens is it says this: Jesus saw her. Okay? Jesus saw her. Jesus saw her pain. Jesus saw her problem. And you'll notice in the story, she never asked to be healed. She just showed up. At no point in this story does she say to Jesus, hey, Jesus, look at me over here. I'm in pain. I need help. Won't you heal me? That is not a feature of this story. She's simply there, and Jesus saw her. So a real simple lesson out of this story for us is, what are you going to see? Whose eyes do you want to have going into the story? Do you want to have the eyes of the person who only sees a rules violation, or do you want to have the eyes of Jesus who goes in and sees her pain and her suffering? See, we have an obligation to see the plight of others. We have an obligation to see it before they even complain. All right? It's I think one of the most loving things that people can do for one another is when they anticipate the needs of someone else and step in. Okay? Because in order to do that, it means you're not just waiting for them to say something. You're thinking about them, and you're thinking about life from their perspective. You're thinking about life in their shoes, and then you're saying, what would make that life a little better? What would make that life a little easier? I think one of the most loving things we ever do is see someone else's need and try to meet it before they ask, before they complain. Okay? Because we can't presume that just because people aren't complaining, everything's okay. People self-suppress, okay? Victims especially self-suppress. We know that in our country there are a lot of victims of assaults, a lot of victims of harassment, a lot of victims of things, and they don't complain. They don't complain because they believe that no one's going to believe them. And so they self-suppress, okay? We have an obligation to see what's going on and then do something about it. All right? Instead, what happens is we so often look at life and look at the situations that are going on from our own perspective. All right? And all we care about is what we see and what's affecting us. And Jesus points this out. When he talks to the crowd, he says, look what you people do. You take care of your animals. And he says, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey, which is work? Untying the animal and leading it out to water is work, so it is also a violation. You do this. But the reason why they do it? It's his ox. It's his donkey. All right? They see the problem when it's theirs. They see the problem when it's their stuff, when it's their animal. They see the problem. And the problem here is that nobody saw the woman as their responsibility. Nobody saw the woman as someone who needed help and that they had some responsibility to care about that circumstance. Even if they didn't have the power that Jesus had to bring healing, at the very least, they shouldn't have resented the fact that Jesus had healed her, had decided that she was his responsibility, had decided to see her. And he's like, look, I'm not seeing her as even more than the relationship you see with one of your animals. If I only saw her with that kind of relationship, I would still take care of her. I would still relieve her suffering. This isn't even something extraordinarily exalting. You take care of your ox, you take care of your donkey. And what we need to do is take care of each other. And Jesus then points us to a pretty simple word that I think ought to describe the way we do look at standards, the way we do look at the way things are in the world. And he says this: ought not this woman. Ought. It's a great word. Ought not this woman be set free? All right. I'm not going to talk about it. Jesus is basically saying, I'm not going to talk about this in terms of the fact that she's been crippled for 18 years. I'm not going to talk about that. All right? I'm not, that's not the issue. Ought, what ought to be? 18 years ought not be 18 years and a day. All right? Ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, be set free? Okay? The status quo, when we respect the status quo, what is becomes what ought to be in our minds. Okay? That becomes the default. It becomes saying, as long as tomorrow is like today, it's okay. And so when we start to reverence the status quo, we're basically saying that what is what ought to be. And the problem is that we know in life there is a ton of stuff that is not what ought to be. And we have an obligation to think about what ought to be, not just what is. Now, how do we do that? How do we do that? There's something I learned about years ago. It was interesting because I've read a lot of stuff that has to do with the development of story. And it was something I read that they said that screenwriters are advised to do when they're working on a story. So they're working on a plot, they're sending characters around and stuff like that. And sometimes they just hit what they think is a dead end. Okay? And so they're like, all right, so here's where we're at. The woman has quit her job and she's got an apartment in Manhattan, and it's like, now where do we go? What's going to happen next to this person? And they said that what they're advised to do is to simply ask the following question. What if? What if? And they're advised, the reason why you see some of these crazy plots that happen, I think, is because they're advised to ask what if without bounds. Okay? So, for example, one of the examples that a person gave talking about this was, all right, so a woman, she's quit her job and she's got a studio apartment in Manhattan. What if she bought a horse? Okay? What if? Now, I'm sure you immediately got these images, right, of her trying to keep this horse in her studio apartment. Maybe, I don't know, maybe she's got a Murphy bed and trying to figure out how to work the horse with the Murphy bed. You can start to see the horse in the elevator coming down. Maybe it's a doorman building holding the, excuse me, can you hold my horse for a second? All right, going for a walk in the street. All right, all kinds of outlandish, crazy things start to come into your mind off that simple question of what if? Right? But maybe that's the kind of thinking that we need to bring to our world and to our own lives. Maybe we need to look at situations that we're in and start to just say, what if? What if? What if I switched careers? What if? What if I went back to school? What if we moved to a different state? What if? All right? Instead of seeing seeing ourselves as confined by what is, instead of seeing our world strictly in terms of the way things are and maybe making some incremental changes from where it is, what if we asked, what if? What if we had the boldness to imagine a completely different circumstance? Because if we don't ask what if, things don't change. What if, what if that woman had somehow been seen or healed earlier? See, the tragedy of the 18 years is, what if she had been healed 18 years before? What could she have done? What might her life have been like? What if she didn't encounter Jesus? What if Jesus didn't heal her? And she spent the next 18 years continuing to be in that circumstance. Right? Think about the differences. Think about what the possibilities are. Think about all the things in our world that are expandable if we're willing to ask, what if? What if all of our kids got great educations? What if all of our kids had nutrition? What if we eliminated poverty? What if? Okay. Instead of so easily falling back into the idea that, poverty exists and there's not much we can do about it, or some kids are going to fall behind and we're just going to leave them behind. What if is a question we need to ask because it unlocks the potential in our lives. But it's something that we have to be brave enough to ask. See, what we need to do is make sure that we don't settle for what is. All right? Jesus came and he upset a lot of people because there were a lot of people who were invested in the idea that what is would always be. And when he came along and he started really saying, what if? What if you stopped worrying about material possessions? What if you actually cared for the poor? What if scared a lot of people who were invested in what is. So don't settle for what is. Don't use what is as the jumping off point for all of your thinking, because you may find that to be inadequate. You may find that to be unreasonably constraining. Instead, free yourself up to ask, what if? Go a little crazy. Worry about the practicalities later. All right? But start with the big what if for the world, the big what if for your life, right? And then that just might inspire you to let go of what is. One of the great speeches of all time was given by Steve Jobs when he introduced the iPhone. And I've referenced this because speechwriters and stuff like that, they use this as one of the great speeches. Literally, I hear people who analyze presentations say that the two great speeches of the last 50, 60 years were Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream and Steve Jobs introducing the iPhone. And they said the reason why both those speeches were so effective is they continually contrasted the way things are with what could be. Martin Luther King, I have a dream, set against the racism of the time. I have a dream, set against all the violence, the prejudice. I have a dream. And by the time he was done, you weren't just thinking about how can we ameliorate some of the racism in the society. You had bought into the dream. And I remember reading the rumors about the iPhone. And then everybody that I know heard about that presentation coming from Jobs. They'd rumored that Apple was working on this. And I remember sitting around with friends, and we were all saying, what do we need this for? My phone makes phone calls. It does it well. And by the time he was done talking, you hated your phone. Because all it did was make phone calls. And now we all carry a phone, and we never make phone calls. Okay? It's the last thing I do with my phone. But I would have been so happy to just have a phone that made phone calls. And by the end of his speech, it wasn't enough. And now, I can't imagine going through life without it. All because some people settled. They refused to settle for what is. And they dared to ask, what if? What kind of revolutionary change is awaiting you if you'll be willing to do the same? Amen.